I've shot 2 previous videos on this important early work by Lev Shestov, All Things Are Possible, also translatable as The Apotheosis of Groundlessness. And this is a work that has a lot to say to us from an existential perspective, not only in the present, but also reflecting on the present of Shestov's own time, which is around the turn of the last century. So he's coming to us after about a century, but everything that he's saying is really just as fresh and as vital, I think, as it was back then. There have been 2 major world wars, the fall of the Soviet Empire, the transformation of the economy in a number of different ways, globalization. But I think that what he actually has to say here about the writer, the thinker, the individual, and society still holds just as much truth for our generations as it would for his own generation. And I'd like to begin by going back to a passage that I brought up in one of the previous videos, where he's talking about philosophical world conceptions. One of the things that we want to think about is there any necessity in philosophy? And that's a very dangerous question for philosophy and for philosophers, because as opposed to the other sciences, which can have a sort of conditioned necessity, so long as you remain within this realm, there can be laws, and we can say there are norms that have to be followed. Philosophy is about the whole. It's about the big questions, the first and final truths. So if we can't attain necessity, then we're posed with these sorts of questions that I'm going to talk about in just a moment. And we start worrying about, well, could I be wrong? Could I be off? How do I know that I can trust anything? So, Shestov tells us every philosophic world conception starts from some or other solution of the general problem of human existence. So we all, in some ways, begin on the same page. But, you might say the paper is crumpled in different ways, if we want to use that metaphor. Some or other solution of the general problem of human existence, and proceeds from this to direct the course of human life in some particular direction or another. What this means is something that other philosophers like, say, Nietzsche are getting at. All philosophy is ultimately practical, in the sense that it is oriented towards figuring out, what the hell am I supposed to do with all of this? One of the responses could be to contemplate it, to think about it, to try to derive a science about it. And that's often, or even to engage in epistemology about it, theory of knowledge, or Kenntnislehre. But that is a choice. That is a practical response. And there's a myriad other possibilities. He says, we have neither the power nor the data for the solution of general problems. And consequently, all of our moral deductions are arbitrary. They only witness to our prejudices if we're naturally timid, or to our propensities and tastes if we're self-confident. And I commented on prejudices and propensities in a previous video, so I'm not going to talk about that. The reason I'm bringing this up in this particular video is because what we're going to look at in great detail here, well, in some detail, I shouldn't promise great, is how Shestov thinks about the creative act of thought itself. And thought has to be grounded in life, and any one single human being's life. This, by the way, is a problem that Hegel was very familiar with and attempted to try to resolve himself in his phenomenology. Any one single human life has its sort of penumbra of experience, and you can move, from place to place and gather more experience. Of course, you're forgetting a lot of things along the way, and you never develop maturity until much later on, so you may not be judging the experience that you're having correctly. And so when you're working with your first principles, your starting points for philosophy, there's a tendency to think that these are not arbitrary, that they impress themselves upon a person. And they do impress themselves upon a person. But which ones we actually pay attention to is in large part arbitrary, and arbitrary in several different ways. There is, the happenstances of where we wind up being, and the people that we're brought into conflict with, and what books we read, and who we see talked about, and what sort of approaches people come to not just in philosophy, but literature, history, all these realms of thought that we call the humanities. Do we have crappy teachers? Do we have good teachers? Are the good teachers actually in agreement with each other, or do they show us that there's the possibility of disharmony among them? These are all things that are contingent. And then you add to it the dimension of choice. We're not compelled in any sort of necessitating way, like a mechanism would be by its composition, or by the way a computer would be. A different, very much more complicated electronic mechanism would be by its hardware or its programming. We have the dimension of choice because we have wills, and they're so radically free that they can't even determine themselves for all time. We have to constantly make new choices, and we become creatures of the habits, and we become creatures of the previous choices that we've made being brought forth into the present. So now, if all that's true, these are very pressing questions, and these are questions that were raised not only, at the beginning of modernity, but also by philosophers in the ancient and medieval periods as well. What can we know for certain? We have a drive, a wish, a will to have something we can depend upon. And there might be all sorts of psychological explanations for this, fear of abandonment. Who knows what is actually going on behind all of that. But we do want certainty in some things. What can we know for certain? Can we know anything for certain? What can we be completely assured of in a sort of sense of not only being able to provide certainty, like checking things off on a list, what can we feel morally assured that will be the case? What can we place our trust in? What would give us certainty? We have proposed for us all sorts of things. Logic, for example. Maybe if we just follow the rules of logic and we only agree to things that we can derive from previous theorems or axioms, or however you like to put it in your particular framework of logic. Even if you expand your logic wide enough, like, say, Hegel tried to, or Dewey, or Blondel, or Comte, or any of these other people, so it would cover a much wider realm than formal logic. There's always this quest to have something guaranteed, something for certain in that. What about morality? Very often honored in the breach, but one of the things that took place in the modern period was this attempt to derive a scientific morality. It's still going on today. We have these neuroscientists, telling us that they finally cracked the code and they know what makes us tick. And usually the solutions that they propose are not ones that Shestov would have been unfamiliar with, because the solutions they propose are actually older than the turn of the century. Society. What does society need? We talked about utilitarianism in the broad sense. Whatever works out for the greatest number ends up getting a lot of weight. Shestov actually says, there's a very interesting little quip that I also considered starting with. This is section 37, very short section. The most important and significant revelations come into the world naked without a wordy garment. To find words for them is a delicate, difficult business, a whole art. That's part of what philosophy or literature, or however you want to put the realm of thought that Shestov is engaging in as a way of life, whatever you want to call that, that's what its job is. Stupidities and banalities, on the contrary, appear at once in ready-made apparel, gaudy even if shabby. So they're ready straight away to be presented to the public. Society, the public, the masses, even the masses that we call elites, which are often just different types of masses, they don't provide us with anything really substantive, anything that we could sink our teeth into, anything that we can truly be satisfied with. What about God? There's an interesting one for Shestov. If you read other works of Shestov, because he doesn't talk about God that much in this one, you find out God is pretty mysterious. And that God actually, oftentimes for Shestov is willing to totally bite the existentialist bullet. goes beyond logic or morality or science or society or certainty, or pick any sort of form of necessity that you like. We live in a period, and Shestov was well aware of this, where on the one hand, like Nietzsche said, God is dead, meaning that people, the old notion of God has ceased to have the allure that it had for many people in solving problems, the God of the gaps. It's really funny to see atheists oftentimes criticizing theists as if they weren't living in a post-Nietzschean period, as if theists just believe in this God of the gaps or stuff like that. I mean, people were starting to say that. I don't really buy that sort of thing. If there is a God, it's not going to look an awful lot like that. Which, by the way, is a point Augustine made back, in the beginning of the Middle Ages. On the other hand, people had displaced God and what God provided, and again, Nietzsche was criticizing this too, and Dostoevsky was criticizing this, into science. Into the view that through some sort of humanly constructed, completely or more and more positively accurate depiction of the way things are, we could attain certainty. We could be assured of things. We could proceed in a way in which we would no longer go wrong as we had been all that time. We would be blessed, so to speak. That was the dream of positivism of all different sorts, whether it be that of the encyclopedists, of Comte, later on logical positivism, of the unspoken positivism of so many other movements contemporary today. So, Shestov has a lot to say about these things, and I want to do something very dramatic at the very beginning, and say that this was a mistaken philosophy, according to Shestov. Now, does that mean that everything becomes arbitrary? In the sense that, well, we just don't know anything, we can't be sure of anything. No, because to be a skeptic is also, in a certain way, to be within this problematic. We have to work from our experience, but our experience is much richer and has many more dimensions than we give it credit for, in part because it connects up with other people, including other geniuses. People who have left behind these great literary monuments that we're not just supposed to look at and read and sort of imitate and worship, but which are supposed to make us think, which are supposed to provoke in us a kind of shock and a recognition of what is actually out there that we were lacking until we read them. And great literature does that for you, whether it's Plato or Homer or Dante, or the great literature of the 20th century. I personally found Borges to be quite stimulating when I was younger myself. So let me shift now and go to one of the problems that arises once we actually dispense with this. So if we want to get rid of these questions like what can we know for certain, what can we be assured of, what would give us certainty of that sort, we can transpose the question slightly and ask instead, who? Who helps us understand, make sense out of reality? And then we should ask ourselves the question, not just who, but why? Why do we think that they can provide us with that? And so he talks about general rules. This is section 40 of the second part. He says, people go to philosophers for general principles. I know this is true because I've been doing philosophy for about half my life and people are always doing this. And since philosophers are human, they're kept supplying the market with general principles. But what sense is there in them? None at all. Nature demands individual creative activity from us. Men won't understand this, so they wait forever for the ultimate truths from philosophy, which they will never get. Or science, or theology, or, pick some other discipline that you like at the time. They wait forever for the ultimate truths, which they will never get. Why should not every grown-up person be a creator, live in his own way, at his own risk, and have his own experience? So it's saying, we need to put ourselves there. Now, that doesn't mean that we have to be totally on our own and sort of recreate Descartes again, go into our stove-heated room and pretend like nobody else in the world exists and then try to recreate them. That would actually just be replication, wouldn't it? That's already been done. He says, children and raw youths must go in leading strings, but adult people who want to feel the reins should be despised. They're cowards and slothful, afraid to try. They eternally go to the wise for advice. And the wise do not hesitate to take the responsibility for the lives of others. They invent general rules as if they had access to sources of knowledge. What foolery! The wise are no wiser than the stupid. They only have more conceit and effrontery. Every intelligent man laughs in his soul at bookish views. And are books not the work of the wise? They are often extremely interesting, but only insofar as they do not contain general rules. When they deviate from this putting out a blueprint, and that's probably actually what makes so many management books so incredibly boring, and so many self-help books so incredibly boring now that I think about it. The fact that they're just like general rules, you get sucked in because they have a couple, anecdotes about Carol and Jim and so-and-so who had this problem. And, by the way, they're only writing those not because they believe in them, but because, you got to put something in there to catch people's attention and drive the point home. And then they come out with these truisms, and you're like, oh, God, I've seen this before. And for every little nugget you have to that's valuable in these kind of works, you have to dig and dig and dig. That's part of why I like great literature, because there's a hell of a lot more nuggets in them right on the surface, and you don't have to do quite so much digging. I suspect that's why Shestov liked that too. So Shestov concludes this passage by saying, there are no all-binding universal judgments. Let us manage with non-binding, non-universal ones. Only professors will suffer for it. So we still actually need to make judgments. We're not dispensing with the act of having to decide, of having to say, this is right, this is wrong. I think that this is the way to go. This is preferable, this is less preferable. We have to do all of that. We have to also become okay, Shestov would say, with not trying to make our views on these things into absolutely binding judgments on everybody. So it would be exactly the opposite of somebody like Kant, but equally opposite the views of somebody like a utilitarian like Mill or Bentham, where it's an appeal to sort of universality of rational beings, whether it be just pure reason or sort of, well, Habermas would fit over here too, sort of putting all the voices together and then seeing what composite comes of it. We have to actually decide for ourselves whose voices we're going to worry about as criteria. Should I subject my choices, my views, to Kant's categorical imperative and to Kant, his way of thinking about things? That's a choice. Should I do it with Socrates? I think I'd do better with Socrates and Plato than I would with Kant, but Kant would still be better than, some other people. There's at least still some questions open that Kant couldn't close. The point is, though, we have to make non-binding judgments that are nonetheless judgments. And they have to do with our engagement with reality. And reality isn't just something that we get to know and get to act on. Reality also acts upon us as well. Through experience. So all of this has been a long sort of circumlocution to get to the point where I really wanted to go, and that is to talk about how Shestov sees creative activity, then derivative activity, and then the figure of what we're going to call the prophet. So let's talk about creative activity itself. And Shestov, a very creative person. I think he's dead on in what he has to say. He says, there's a section called Practical Advice, section 42 of part 1. People who read much must always keep it in mind that life is one thing, literature another. So, we have to avoid falling into the book, so to speak. Not that authors invariably lie. I declare there are writers who rarely and most reluctantly lie, but one must know how to read, and that isn't easy. Out of 100 book readers, 99 have no idea what they're reading about. It's a common belief, for example, any writer who sings of suffering must be ready at all times to open his arms to the weary and heavy laden. This is what readers feel when they read his books. Then when they approach him with their woes and find out that he runs away without looking back at them, they're filled with indignation and talk of the discrepancy between word and deed. Whereas the fact is, the singer has more than enough woes of his own, and he sings them because he cannot get rid of them. It'd be sort of if you went to a writer of pornography and they turned out not to be a sexy person, or you go to a writer of detective literature and there's nothing mysterious whatsoever about them. Writers write about the things that they're focused on, and I know this is the case for me with the kind of writing that I do yet, academic writing. We write about the things that puzzle us, that we can't get out of our system. That's why, for example, I've got writings on Thomas Hobbes, and I am not a Hobbesian by any means. But there's things about his work that draw me in, that make me want to think and write about that. And what happens? People don't understand how it works for the kind of creativity that's required for writing. Later on, actually earlier on, he says, the raptures of creative activity, empty words invented by men who never had an opportunity of judging from their own experience, but who derive their conclusions syllogistically. This actually deserves to be put on the board because it's such a funny thing to say. So, what is a syllogism? A syllogism is a form of argument. Not the only form, and as a side note, what Aristotle called syllogism need not be understood as what the scholastics and later logicians called it. It was a little bit wider. But he says, if a creation gives us such delight, so this is actually not a syllogism, by the way, it's actually an enthymeme. If a syllogism gives us such delight, what must the creator experience? And notice this is not put in syllogistic form, but we can easily do so by deleting this, saying the creator, turn this not into a question but into a declaration. The creator must experience something quite similar in delight. And what's missing in between here? There's some sort of bridge. This is what Aristotle actually calls an enthymeme. In an enthymeme, the audience has to supply the missing premise, or the conclusion, or other bits. And what's missing here? Well, there's an assumption that's being made, and it is an if-then, that if a creation gives such delight to us, to who? To the observer, the creator must experience similar delight. And what's missing here is an if-then. If observing creation gives delight, then creating creative things must give delight as well. And how do you know that's true? What would that actually be based upon? Who could actually make that sort of assertion, even as a non-binding judgment, not a necessary judgment applying to all, but just a non-binding judgment? It could only be creators. It could only be people who actually have some experience of the processes, not just the products, but the processes of creation. And what does Shestov tell us about this? He says, usually the creator feels only vexations. Every creation is created out of the void. Here actually he's saying something very similar to Heidegger about the nothing. In what is metaphysics. At the best, the maker finds himself confronted with a formless, meaningless, usually obstinate and stiff matter which yields reluctantly to form, and he does not know how to begin. Each time a new thought is engendered, so often must that new thought, which for the moment seems so brilliant and fascinating, be thrown aside as worthless. And this is indeed part of the process of creation. As creators throughout the ages have told us, it is not a, just throw stuff up there on the canvas and hey, it looks good. You have to ruin a lot of canvases and spill a lot of paint before you come up with a beautiful picture. You have to make a lot of terrible music before you start making mediocre music, before you start making decent music, before you start making good music, before you start making brilliant music. When it comes to writing, you have to throw out most of what you write. Even again, when it comes to academic writing, the best advice that I was ever given about writing my dissertation was that I needed to write 3 pages every weekday, and then at the end of the week, on that Saturday, go back over those 15 pages and cull out 3 or 4 pages that were not complete crap. And get rid of the rest. Or keep it for whatever I wanted to do. If I wanted to play around with it later, that would be fine. But I needed to find some stuff that was actually decent in all of that meandering around. That is what's required. Creative work is tough. And I'd like to say 2 other things that he's not mentioning here. One is that the creator not only works upon what it is that they're creating, oftentimes the creator has to work upon themselves. And that is even tougher, because you've got really no idea what you're creating when you start changing yourself, when you start monkeying around with your drives and desires and how you're going to interpret your experiences, any of those sorts of things. It's really going out on a limb. And this holds just as much for the philosopher as for the performance artist. If we want to think about like risky art, usually we think about stuff over there. But philosophy is like that too. And so is generating a new reading of Hamlet. And so is putting Hamlet on a stage. There's all these risks that have to be taken. All this playing around with things that don't seem to pay off. That's what creative activity consists in. The other thing that I want to say too is anybody who is trying to rework their life, whether it be their person, their outward circumstances, if they don't have a blueprint for doing that, and oftentimes for the most important things there aren't very good blueprints, they're engaged in this process, and it's a painful process. It's not a fun time just, finger painting, doing whatever you like. So he says, creative activity is a continual progression from failure to failure, and the condition of the creator is usually one of uncertainty, mistrust, and shattered nerves. The more serious and original the task for which a man sets himself, the more tormenting is the self-misgiving. For this reason, even men of genius cannot keep up the creative activity to the last. As soon as here's where now the twist takes place. As soon as they've acquired their technique, they begin to repeat themselves. A cycle begins. Well aware that the public willingly endures the monotony of a favorite, even finds virtue in it. Every connoisseur of art is satisfied if he recognizes in a new work the accepted manner of the artist. And here, we're getting to something really interesting. So, let me put it to you in very blunt, but hopefully still Shestovian terms. So we have the artist, or the thinker, and they are living a life, right? And through that they have experience, and their experience is giving them some sort of hard-earned principles and ideas, and those go into a product. Now that product could be a work of art, it could be a style of life, it could be a philosophy. There's all sorts of things. Could be a self-help book, could be a self-help movement, could be a new diet, could be a new management style. There's all sorts of things. We don't necessarily have to restrict it just to artists and people in the humanities. I mean, this could actually apply to people in business management. That's probably actually a sign that there's some truth to it. So the artist has to struggle through this process. Right? And they have to struggle because in order to get that product, they have to take raw materials and they somehow have to put form into this matter that resists it. And it might be the matter is partly the artist themselves. They have to develop technique. To become a philosopher, you can't just read philosophy, you actually have to start thinking like a philosopher. You have to do philosophy. Now, once you've done this, there's a temptation, and that's what he's talking about here. There's actually a double temptation. And this comes about because there is a public. And the public just sees this and appreciates that. Says, I like that. Make me some more. And that's a hell of a lot easier to do the second time around, isn't it? The artist is able, they now know, or the philosopher, or the manufacturer, they now know how to do the process. We could think about this in terms of moral reformation and going from vices and acrasia to developing a virtue. Are all the virtues the same? Do we develop them all in the same way? Well, maybe you figure out how to be courageous, to make of yourself a courageous person as the product. Now you just got to do the same thing with justice, or good humor, or righteous anger, or charity, or something like that. But maybe they're not the same. And maybe by superimposing the same form, you're just repeating the same thing, and you're not really generating any new, radically new products. And maybe you're starting to slip away from reality. And the public is going to applaud you for that. Because they can recognize it. They can say, yeah, I get this. I didn't get it the first time around, but I wasn't an early adopter, as we say. But now that it's on Facebook and whatever website, pick whatever blog you like. Just think about the fact that blogs have become a big thing now. When originally they were just people just putting random stuff up there, or having to work really hard to make some sense out of things. Once the public has a form they can identify with, it's very easy for the artist or thinker to slip into that. The other thing is, and this is where Shestov is saying something very profound about philosophy itself. It's not just a danger for the public. It's not just a danger for that thinker. It's a danger for the ones who will come after. It's a danger for what we might call, and I'll put them over here, the disciple. The disciple or the student. So why is there a great danger for the disciple or the student coming out of this entire process of creative activity and then appropriation, reduplication, and calling for more creative activity? Why is that an issue? Well, here's what Shestov says. Theories of sequence and consequence are binding only on the disciples, not on the masters. Fathers of great ideas tend to be very careless about their progeny, giving very little heed to their future career. So let's take philosophy, for example, and we can then extend this into artwork or music or other things. So somebody like Plato comes around. And Plato is a student of Socrates, and he's inheriting a lot of thought from Socrates, but he's also he's surpassing his teacher. If Xenophon Socrates is in some respects the baseline for and what it has in common with Plato Socrates, if that's the real Socrates, then Plato went very far beyond his master and brought together a lot of other influences. Is Plato completely consistent? No. He's not even consistent in the stories that he has Socrates tell about, what happens after we die. There are points of consistency that run through things, but there's some inconsistencies as well. And what happens then when the disciples come around? They tread the same footsteps. They say, we've got to be able to find some way to systematize this, to make sense out of this. And, in a certain respect, the real Platonists, the real heirs to Plato and his passion and his power are people like, on the one hand, Plotinus, and on the other hand, way down the line, Kierkegaard. Not so much the people of his school. So there's a danger for the disciples of forgetting something that the masters knew. He says, conscientious disciples wasting away under the arduous effort to discover that which does not exist are brought to despair of their task. What is the task? The offspring of one and the same philosopher frequently bear such small resemblance to one another it's impossible to discern the family connection. Then, these people, having ceased their attempt at reconciling glaring contradictions, they only insist the harder on the necessity for studying the philosophers, studying them minutely, circumstantially, historically, philologically even. So the history of philosophy is born. And what he's talking about as history of philosophy there is something very different than what I conceive of history of philosophy as being and what I try to do, for instance, in these videos. What he means is this sort of scientific, determining why exactly did Leibniz think that thought there? What was going on in history that led him to use that term? And that's very boring stuff, ultimately. It can be quite useful, it can be handy, it can be interesting for a little while, but once you've produced it, you're left saying, so what? Now, reading Leibniz and thinking the thoughts of Leibniz, that's a whole different ballgame. And every great philosopher, we think of them as like, discovering great truths that are out there and, bringing them down to earth and saying, hey, look at this, there's a system here. Really what they're doing is they're kind of like sticking themselves into reality and wedging part of it open and saying, aha, there's something there. And that act of like doing the jaws of life almost, so to speak, is a way in which they do something creative, something productive. Something that their disciples, their students are not doing. That's why, who's the greatest Platonist ever? Aristotle. Because he did it differently than Plato. He said, aha, I can do that too. But I'm not going to do it like you did. I'm going to do some things a bit differently. He talks about this a little bit more. Saying, in the ultimate questions of life, we're not a bit nearer the truth than our ancestors were. Theories of sequence and consequence are binding only upon disciples whose single virtue lies in their scrupulous, logical developing of their master's idea. But their masters, Shestov says, invent ideas and therefore have the right to substitute one for the other. The sovereign power which proclaims a law has the same power to abolish it. But the duty of the subordinate consists in the praise and the consequential interpretation and the strict observance of the dictates of the higher will. So what's going on with all this? Well, again, we can think of this process of trying to attain certainty, something that can be assured, something that we know has value. It worked out the first time for, pick whoever you like, say Hegel. So therefore, if we just stick with Hegel's logic and phenomenology and try to interpret the whole world through it, we'll get something kind of similar to that. Or maybe we should, like Marx, turn the dialectic upside down. Or maybe we should, like Kierkegaard, say, dialectic's all great, but you left out this strata up here, the religious. Or we should, like Maurice Blondel, say, I love this dialectic idea of yours, but there's so much more that you didn't actually get into it that I'm going to take a new look, and I'm going to do it not through thought, not through being, but through action. Those are the people who aren't disciples. Those are the people who are themselves new artists and thinkers. So here's the alternative that one has to decide. When you love some philosophy, when you love some work of art, when you love some movement, when there's something that you really like, and you're not just being the admiring public, but you actually want to create yourself. And this could go for moral life as well. When there's a way of living, a way of praying, a way of relating to others that you particularly admire, are you going to look at the person who derived that as having had the final word on it, and that this product reflects some sort of necessity that constrains any possible new thing on your part, in which case you're going to be a disciple. And you might be a very good disciple. You may, in fact, be very faithful to the master, and you might be the best interpreter of their stuff. And that's not a bad thing. But it's not creativity. For creativity, it has to be done anew. And this doesn't mean, burning the ships and departing completely from all previous norms, trying to do something so radically different that, the whole world will sit up and praise you. That's already been done, actually. What it means is to be able to recognize, to develop a capacity for judgment for when you actually need to, lever it open and say, I need something that Plato didn't give me. And I've got this. Because I've got this experience that's given me some new ideas that I can work with. And maybe I can still use a lot of Plato's ideas, or Aristotle's, or Hegel's, or Shestov's, for that matter. Shestov would not want disciples. Shestov is trying to provoke everybody to, in some way, be an artist or a thinker. There's one other thing that he says about this sort of process. He says, each philosopher invents his own truths, which means he asks his pupils to deceive himself in the way that he shows, but he reserves for himself the option of deceiving himself in his own way. Why? Why not allow everyone to deceive himself just as he likes? That's kind of a nice tongue-in-cheek thing. There is another danger that comes with this whole thing as well. And that's not only the problem of having a public and disciples and all of that. That would be problematic enough because who is actually well enough attuned to their own BS and strong enough in their humility to resist the temptations to start going along with that. Not a lot of us, including myself. There's a great danger of the thinker turning into something different. So the thinker is engaged in creativity and risk. And they do so for a public, they do so for people who are going to come after them. They're primarily doing so for themselves. There's a great danger when they're successful of turning into a prophet. What does it mean to be a prophet? Well, it means to speak for God, or something that is put on the same level as God. And, if you look at the biblical prophets, usually they're not happy with being prophets at all. As a matter of fact, usually they're fairly reluctant. Some of them actually have to be compelled, like Jonah, for example. And even after he's compelled, he doesn't understand why God did what he did, and he's ticked off with God, and God has to have a little talk with him. Moses was a reluctant prophet. Jeremiah, definitely not into the prophet thing. Spends a lot of time saying how crappy it is being a prophet. But at the same time, there's a lot of people who like the feeling of getting to sort of say the things that matter, to be the ones who are in touch with the zeitgeist, the spirit of the age, who enunciate it. And you can see this. There are some people at some times who actually do, without realizing it, say the things that need to be said at that point in time, and everything comes together, and you say, yeah, that makes perfect sense. Now, is that because of them? Or is that because of the audience? Or is that because of the times? Or is that because of the exigencies? It's usually a combination of those. But there's a tendency for people then to assume the role of being a prophet, of getting to speak for what really matters. Whether they're a prophet of being or God or science, what have you. So there's a tendency for this to happen with writers in particular, he says. I mean, it's harder to be a prophet with music unless you actually have lyrics. And people kind of expect musicians to be full of crap anyway, at least by the time they're in their 20s. They expect that. He says a writer, particularly a young and inexperienced writer, feels himself under an obligation to give the reader the fullest answers to all possible questions. Conscience will not let him shut his eyes to tormenting problems, so he begins to speak of first and ultimate things. As he can't say anything profitable on such subjects, because he doesn't know anything, right? It's not the business of the young to be profoundly philosophical. He grows excited. He shouts himself to hoarseness. In the end, he's silent from exhaustion. And then, if his words have had any success with the public, he's astonished to find that he has become a prophet. Whereupon, if he be an average sort of person, he's filled with an insatiable desire to preserve his influence to the end of days. That's the danger with becoming a prophet, is wanting to remain relevant, wanting to be in the know, wanting to be right. Somebody gets a few things right, and now suddenly everybody's looking to them. It's a very dangerous situation because it's hard to resist the temptation to think, I do know more than these other people. As a matter of fact, I've given so much to my art, to my discipline, to my skill. I probably know way more, and I could fix their lives, and I could make sense out of things. The trouble is, prophets are often wrong. The only prophets that you can rely on are those who actually speak for God or the divine or whatever it is, and telling them apart is kind of a problem. By the way, if you look at the Bible, there's this constant problem discussed of false prophets. So, he says, if he be more sensitive or gifted than usual, he begins to despise the crowd and himself for having posed in the stupid and disgraceful character of a clown of lofty ideas. So, if you resist the temptation to become a prophet, you might become very jaded. some people can become both. Dostoevsky was an example of that. Shestov talks about quite a bit. I'm talking about one other passage where he talks about prophecy, and then I'm going to mention a work in which this plays an important role. So, he talks about this. He says, when a man is young, he writes because it seems to him he's discovered a new almighty truth which he must make haste to impart to forlorn mankind. That's good. That's the vitality of youth. Later, becoming more modest, he begins to doubt his truths, and then he writes to convince himself. That's taking a bit more. A few more years go by, and he knows he was mistaken all around, so there's no need to convince himself. Nevertheless, he continues to write because he's not fit for any other work, and to be accounted a superfluous man is so horrible. People don't want to think of themselves as being out of the know, as no longer having anything relevant to say. So that is a key problem. Let me see here. Now, Dostoevsky is somebody who Shestov was very influenced by, takes very seriously, sees connections between Dostoevsky and Nietzsche, and also highlights, parallels, contrasts between Dostoevsky and other Russian authors like Tolstoy, Chekhov, Turgenev, I think it's supposed to be pronounced. And he had an opportunity to write a piece for the 25-year anniversary of Dostoevsky's death. What he wrote was called The Gift of Prophecy. And he starts out by talking about how Vladimir Soloviev used to call Dostoevsky the prophet and even the prophet of God. And he says, immediately after Soloviev, although often in complete independence of him, very many people looked upon Dostoevsky as the man to whom the books of human destiny were opened, and this happened not only after his death, but while he was still alive. Apparently, Dostoevsky himself, if he did not regard himself as a prophet, at least thought it right that all people should see a prophet in him. And Shestov is actually criticizing Dostoevsky for going along with this. And I'm not actually going to read too much from this because, that's not all things are possible. This is a different essay. But I think it is relevant here. He says, how shall a man be greater than himself in the world of literature? If he would move, then by his own will or in spite of it, he must step onto another plane. And this is plainly the beginning of prophecy in a writer. In the general view, the prophet is always greater than the writer. And even the possession of genius is not always a guarantee against the general view. So how did Dostoevsky start playing the prophet? He talks about this. He says, Dostoevsky wanted to be a prophet. He wanted people to listen to him and cry Hosanna because, I say again, he thought if men had ever cried Hosanna to anyone, there was no reason why he, Dostoevsky, should be denied the honor. I mean, if you really have a lot to say, it's tempting to be the prophet because otherwise some other schmucks are going to come along and play the prophet and mislead people. So you might as well be the prophet just so that people are misled a little less, you could say. He says, and this is where I'm going to actually end this. He's making this contrast. He says, the underworld, whereinto his fate had but lately driven him, it might seem forever, now appeared to him a phantasmagoria which had never been real. In the galleys in the underworld had been born within him a great hunger for God, which lived long. There he fought a great fight, the fight of life against death. There for the first time were made the new and awful experiments with allied Dostoevsky with everything that is rebellious and restless on earth. That's the beginning. That's the early Dostoevsky. What Dostoevsky wrote during the closing years of his life has value only insofar as Dostoevsky's past is reflected therein. He made no new step outward. As he was, so he remained on the eve of a great truth. But in the old days that did not suffice him. He hungered for something beyond, but now he does not want to struggle. He cannot explain to himself or to others what is really happening within him. He pretends to be struggling still. More, he behaves as though he had won the final victory and demands that his triumph should be acknowledged by public opinion. He loves to think the night has already passed and the actual day begun, and the galleys and the underworld, reminding him that the day are not yet, are no more. All the evidences of a complete illusion of victory seem to be there. Let him only choose the text and preach. And there's a lot more really brilliant stuff in that essay, but I don't want to take away from All Things Are Possible. So what we see is there's a problematic for anybody who is going to do creative work, whether that be as a thinker, as a lover, as an artist, as somebody who's taking care of other people and their needs. These are all ways in which we bring new things into existence, and things that can be quite valuable. Things that reveal to us something of the truth of who we are and what the world is, and of good and evil, and all these things that we hunger for answers about. But there are dangers. We can very easily lose sight of just what creative activity demands of us. The fact that there's a public ready to hear that, ready to flatter us, ready to tell us we should conform to its tastes, might make us disciples, might make us just parts of that public, might make us abandon the need to do what we have to do in order to make creative work happen through us, oftentimes in spite of us. And the greatest danger of all is of succeeding and being cast in the role of the prophet. Because once you're up on that dais, it's very difficult to want to get yourself down. But these demands, these drives, these concerns are not compatible, not very compatible, not even remotely compatible with wanting to live the genuinely philosophical life that Shestov is sketching out in this great work, All Things Are Possible.